The last time I sat on that bench, Ruthen was beside me. She had her hands wrapped around her own cup, and she was watching the light leave the Cascades the way she always did, like she was memorizing it. That was 3 falls ago, and I had told myself every season since that I was going to go back up. I told myself that in November when the first snow came down off the ridge. I told myself that the following June when the fire road opened again, and I had no reason not to drive it. I did not go. I kept finding reasons that seemed good enough, and after 14 months they had stopped feeling like reasons and started feeling like the shape of my life. Then, one evening in early October, I packed that thermos the way she used to pack it, with the coffee strong and a little too much sugar, and I put Dell in the cab. And I drove up the mountain to decide whether I was going to sell the property and leave this county for good. I want to tell you what happened up there. I have carried it for going on 9 months now, and I have told pieces of it to one person, and that person is the only one who did not immediately look for somewhere else to rest their eyes. So I am going to tell the whole thing, from the beginning, and let you make of it what you will. My name is Clayton Reynolds. I spent 31 years with the Forest Service as a fire lookout, which means I spent 31 years learning to read a piece of ground the way other men read a newspaper. You learn over that kind of time what belongs and what does not. You learn the specific quality of silence before a weather change, the way a stand of timber sounds different when something large is moving through it versus when the wind takes it, the small catalogue of animal behaviours that mean everything is ordinary versus the ones that mean it is not. I retired 4 years ago at 57, and Ruthen and I had planned for it. We had the cabin property on the lower slope, 6 acres she had picked out herself before we were married, and we had the bench up on the fire road pullout where we used to go to watch the sun drop behind the western range. Those were the 2 things she said she wanted out of my retirement: the property and the evenings on that bench. She got 18 months of both. The illness came on fast, and it went faster. 4 months from the first appointment to the last morning, and then the cabin felt like a place I was visiting rather than living in, and the bench felt like something I could not afford to look at directly. I kept the property because selling it would have required decisions I was not capable of making in the first year. I kept the thermos on the counter because that was where it had always been. I did not use it. Dell was 11 by then, a black and tan hound my father had given us as a pup the year before he passed, and in the months after Ruthen went, Dell stayed close to my left heel the way old dogs sometimes do when they have decided something. He was not a dramatic animal. He did not pace or cry at the door. He just stayed within about 3 feet of me for the better part of a year, and I found that arrangement more acceptable than most human comfort, which I did not know how to receive anyway. My son Warren lived in Ohio. We had not spoken since the week of the funeral, which had not gone the way either of us intended. I do not assign the blame for that in a simple direction. There were things said and things not said, and by the time the drive back to the county had gone cold behind me, we had arrived at a silence that neither of us reached across. 14 months of it. Ruthen would have reached across it herself if she had been there to do it, and knowing that did not make reaching easier. It made it harder. The decision about the property had been building all summer. A man in town named Garrett Pulliam, who ran a small land brokerage out of a converted hardware store on Route 9, had come out to the cabin twice to talk numbers. He was polite about it, which made it worse. He did not press. He left his card on the kitchen table both times and told me to take whatever time I needed, and what he meant by that was that the offer was standing, and the market was where it was, and whenever I was ready, he would be ready. The number he quoted was fair, more than fair, given what I had put into the place. The problem was that selling the property meant deciding to be somewhere else, and I had not yet located where that would be. Every place I imagined putting myself felt like a place Ruthen was not in, which was true of everywhere, which was true of the cabin too, so rationally the argument fell apart. Rationally, it fell apart easily. Mornings in the cabin, standing at the counter where her thermos had been, rationality was a less useful instrument. I want to be honest about where I was that October. I was not in danger of doing anything irreversible in any direction. I was simply a 61-year-old man who had been carrying a decision for 7 months without being able to set it down or make it, and the weight of it had started to feel structural, like it had become part of how I stood. The mountain had always been where I went to think clearly. 31 years of elevation and clean sight lines had built that association into me. I had not used it in 14 months. That evening, something shifted enough that I packed the thermos and put Dell in the cab. The fire road was in decent shape for October. I had driven it enough times to know its particular sequence of ruts and washouts, the place where a hemlock had come down across the shoulder 3 years back and left a permanent jog in the line. The long straightaway near the top where the pavement gave out, and the packed gravel took over, and the whole world opened up on the western side. Ruthen used to start watching for that view from about a quarter mile before it appeared. She would sit forward in the seat a little, which was the most anticipation she ever showed about anything. Dell rode the whole way with his head resting on the doorsill, his jowls gathering air, which was his normal arrangement on a drive. I told him we were going up to think, which I understood was a statement made for my own benefit rather than his. And he moved one ear slightly without lifting his head. The pull-out at the top was empty, which I had expected. It was a Tuesday in the first week of October, and the weekend hikers were gone, and the hunting season had not opened yet. I parked facing west and sat in the cab for a moment before getting out, looking at the bench. It was where it had always been. Split from a single fir log, roughly 5 feet long, set on 2 rounds of the same timber, no back to it, just the flat surface and the view. We had dragged it up ourselves the 2nd year after I retired, which had taken the better part of a morning and more trouble than it probably warranted for a piece of wood. Ruthen had picked the spot, which was slightly to the right of the pull-out's natural centre, positioned to see the ridgeline above the gap in the hemlock stand. She had a specific relationship with that view. I got out and let Dell down, and he did what he usually did, which was walk a slow perimeter of the pull-out with his nose at ground level, cataloguing whatever had come through since anyone last paid attention. I poured nothing yet from the thermos. I carried it to the bench and set it down beside me and looked west and tried to locate the version of myself that had known how to think clearly up here. The evening was cool but not cold, maybe 48 degrees, with a thin cloud cover that had been moving through since midday without dropping anything. The western light was doing what it does in early October, going warm and lateral across the ridge faces, the hemlock stands throwing long shadows down the slope. I could hear a pair of ravens somewhere below the pull-out, working the treetops, their calls carrying up in that specific hollow way that means open sky above them. Everything was ordinary. I sat there for about 20 minutes. I thought about Garrett Pulliam's offer, and I thought about the cabin. And I thought about the drive to Ohio and what I might say when I got there. I had drafted that conversation in my head more times than I could count, and it always arrived at the same place, which was me standing in a doorway with nothing adequate in my mouth. I did not arrive at any decision in those 20 minutes. I was aware that I was stalling, and I let myself stall because the view was doing something useful and I was not ready to end it. Then Dell stopped. He had been working the far edge of the pull-out, near where the gravel gave way to the hemlock duff, and he simply stopped. Not the way he stopped when he caught a scent he wanted to investigate, not the raised hackle stop of a dog that has found something threatening. He just went still, with his nose about 6 inches off the ground and his tail hanging level, and he stayed that way. I have owned dogs for most of my life, and I have seen a lot of different kinds of still. That particular still was new. I watched him for a moment without moving. If you've ever been out in country, you know well when it goes quiet in the wrong way. You know what I mean. Leave a comment if you've had a moment like that, when the land stopped sounding like itself. I want to keep going, because this is the part that took me 2 years to explain to myself, and I still haven't gotten all the way there. The ravens had stopped. That was the first thing I noticed after Dell went still. They had been calling steadily for the better part of my time at the bench, and they had gone quiet between 1 second and the next. Not the way birds go quiet when something startles them, which involves a burst of wing and alarm, but quietly, as if someone had simply turned down the volume. No thrush in the hemlock below. No squirrel racket from the fir snags to the north, and there had been squirrel racket since I parked. Just a quality of silence that pressed slightly, the way silence in a room presses after someone has left it. I am not a man who uses the word eerie. I have spent 31 years in wilderness conditions, and I have no patience for dramatic interpretation of ordinary natural events. I sat there and I ran through my list of explanations, and the first 2 were reasonable. A raptor moving through the canopy would quiet the smaller birds, and a change in wind direction could explain Dell's interest and the sudden absence of sound. I checked the wind. It had not changed. I checked the sky above the hemlock stand. There was nothing moving through it. I stood up from the bench and walked over to Dell. He was at the edge of the duff, maybe 30 feet from where I had been sitting, and when I came up beside him, he did not react to me. That was unusual. Dell had been reacting to my proximity for 11 years, with some form of acknowledgement, a tail movement or an ear shift or at minimum a lean. He gave me nothing. He stayed fixed on something in the hemlock stand that I could not see, and his breathing was slow and regular and entirely unconcerned, which was the thing that kept me from being concerned myself. I stood beside him and looked into the hemlock stand and saw nothing except hemlock and shadow, and the last of the lateral light cutting through the gaps. After a minute or 2, Dell sat down, which was not a thing he did when something worried him. He just folded himself down onto the duff and kept watching. So I went back to the bench. That was when I saw the bench had moved. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I am 61 years old and I walked a quarter-mile grid of fire lookout observation terrain for 31 years, which means my spatial memory is not a thing I question. The bench had been facing west-northwest since the morning Ruthen, and I placed it. I knew its angle the way I knew the layout of my own kitchen. It was now facing west-southwest, rotated maybe 15 degrees, opening the view toward the lower gap in the ridge where the sun actually dropped on clear October evenings. That was the view Ruthen had said she wished it faced. I remember the conversation specifically, because she had said it matter-of-factly, and I had told her we could reset it any time, and she had said it was fine as it was. And we never did reset it. I walked around the bench slowly. The ground around it had been swept clean. Not raked, not disturbed in any mechanical way, but cleared of the loose duff and the hemlock needles that had been accumulating against the windward side since the last time anyone touched it, which was the spring before Ruthen got sick. The 2 rounds of timber that served as legs had new compression marks in the soil beneath them, consistent with the bench having been lifted and set down again rather than dragged. There were no tool marks. There were no tracks in the duff that I could attribute to anything I had a name for. The tracks that were there were large, widely spaced, and pressed deep. I crouched over the nearest impression for a long time. My mind went through its inventory in the way it had been trained to go through inventory. Bear tracks are what people expect in this country. And I knew bear tracks the way I knew my own handwriting. These were not bear tracks. The proportions were wrong, the toe spread was wrong, and there was a heel depth that bears simply do not produce. A bear's weight distribution is different. I had surveyed enough black bear sign in 31 years to know this in my body rather than from a book. I checked the perimeter of the pullout. More impressions along the duff margin. A hemlock branch, the kind of low limb that lines the edge of a dense stand, had been bent back and held in a way that suggested something had been standing at the tree line for some time, leaning its weight against the branch rather than moving through it. The branch was thick enough that I could not bend it with both hands. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, and I looked at the bench in its new position and the swept ground around it and the impressions in the duff, and I thought about every rational explanation I had left, and I ran out of them one by one. The weather had not done this. No animal I knew in this country had done this. The bench weighed what I estimated to be close to 140 pounds. Because I had helped carry it, and I knew the feel of that weight, and nothing with hands small enough to leave small prints could have moved it without mechanical aid. I was not frightened. I want to say that plainly because it is true, and because it surprises me still. I was attentive in a way I had not been attentive in 14 months. Every part of me that had gone grey and mechanical in the months since Ruthen was suddenly operating again, not from alarm, but from the specific interest that comes when the world behaves in a way that requires your full observation. I had missed that feeling. I had not known how much until I felt it return. Dell had come to stand beside me at some point, without my noticing. He was leaning against my left calf, not pressing, just present. And when I looked down at him, he looked up at me with the specific expression he wore when he was waiting for me to arrive at a conclusion he had already reached. I put my hand on his head for a moment. The sun was getting close to the ridgeline. I had maybe 30 minutes of usable light. I went back to the bench and sat down on it in its new position, and I will tell you that the view from that angle was better. It was not marginally better. It was the view I had been trying to see from that bench for 4 years. The specific gap in the ridge where the sun dropped in October. The way the last light went sideways through the hemlock stand and turned the whole slope below to copper. Ruthen had seen this from a slightly wrong angle for every evening we had spent up here, and she had never complained about it, and I had never fixed it. I sat with the thermos in my lap, and I did not open it yet, and the light kept doing what October light does, and after a few minutes I became aware that something had changed at the tree line. The hemlock stand at the north edge of the pullout was maybe 40 feet from the bench. It began as a ragged line of smaller trees and thickened quickly into old growth, the trunks getting large fast, the understory dark and dense. I had been looking at that stand all my adult life, and I knew its particular architecture the way you know the furniture arrangement of a room. Something was standing in it that I did not have a category for. I did not see it all at once. The attention comes in stages when you have spent your life reading landscape, and what I registered first was a discontinuity in the vertical pattern. Hemlock trunks have a particular spacing and a particular color at dusk, and they do not produce shapes at the height of 8 to 9 feet that hold still. This one held still. I tracked the shape for several seconds before my mind assembled it into something three-dimensional, and when it did, I sat very quietly and did not move. It was large. I am careful with my estimates because I spent 3 decades making professional estimates of size and distance, and I will not overstate this. Whatever was standing in the hemlock stand was tall enough that the nearest trunk, which I had measured once at close to 7 feet to its lowest branch, cleared its shoulder. The shape was broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that was not consistent with any animal I knew in this country, and it was standing upright with its weight distributed the way a person stands when they are not intending to go anywhere. Its color was dark, a brown-black that caught no light in the hemlock shadow except at the outer margin of one shoulder where the last of the copper sky reached in. Dell sat down. That was the thing. Dell, who had hunted with me for 7 years before his joints made hunting impractical, who had treed raccoons and followed deer trails through terrain that would have turned back most dogs, sat down with a small, settled exhalation and rested his chin on my boot. He did not bark. He did not press against my leg in the way dogs press when something frightens them. He just sat down as if the situation had resolved to his satisfaction and rested his chin on my boot. I looked back at the tree line. The shape had not moved. It was simply present in the way that old trees are present, with a quality of having been there a long time and not being troubled by the fact of being seen. I sat with it, and my heart was doing something complicated that I did not examine too closely, and the light kept going, and the western sky turned from copper to a thin band of pale green above the ridge, and the hemlock stand went very dark. I am not a person who believes things easily. I want to be clear about that. I spent my career in the kind of work where believing the wrong thing about a smoke column could cost lives, and I learned early to hold my interpretations lightly and my observations firmly. What I observed in that hemlock stand was a living creature of considerable size, standing upright, watching me, for a period I would estimate at close to 12 minutes, without any behavior I could read as threat or aggression. That is what I observed. The interpretation I have placed on the rest of what happened, I hold more lightly, and I am honest about that. It stepped forward once, to the edge of the stand. In the thin remaining light, I could see it clearly, for perhaps 10 seconds, and then the light went further, and I was working from memory. I will tell you what I saw in those 10 seconds, and I will not add to it. It was roughly 8.5 feet tall. Its face was broad. Its eyes caught the last ambient light from the sky in the way that large animals' eyes sometimes do, not as a flash but as a steady reflection, and it was looking at the bench. Not at me, at the bench. And it was holding something. In its right hand, carried at its side with the ease of something very light, was a hemlock bow, a single long bow, dry from the season, its needles gone silver, the kind that falls in late summer when the tree sheds its oldest growth. It was maybe 4 feet long. I watched it carry that bow to the bench. It did not approach me. I want to be precise about this. It walked to the bench from the north side, on the far end from where I was sitting, and it set the bow across the bench surface with a deliberateness that I recognized. The same care that goes into setting something down in a particular way. Positioning it. It took a moment with the placement, and then it stepped back. I sat perfectly still. Dell did not move from my boot. Ruthann had a habit I had never described to anyone. Before she sat down on that bench, every single time we came up here, she would set something on the surface of it first. Sometimes her jacket, folded. Sometimes the small thermos sleeve she carried. Once, a handful of early huckleberries she had picked along the road. She set something down, and then she sat. I had never been able to ask her why she did it. I had assumed it was a private thing, the way some people have private preparations they do not explain, and I had watched her do it for 4 years without remarking on it. It was simply part of how she sat on that bench. The creature stepped back to the tree line. It did not turn and run. It walked back into the hemlock stand the way it had come out, deliberately, without particular speed, and by the time I thought to stand, it was gone. There was no sound of movement in the stand. No branch breaking, no duff compression, nothing. Just the hemlock dark, and then the pale band of sky above the ridge, and then the silence of the pullout settling back into its ordinary register. A raven called somewhere below, a single note, and then nothing. I sat on that bench for a long time after. The cold came down from the ridge the way cold does in October when the last light goes, and Dell eventually shifted from my boot to press against my left knee, which was his colder weather position. I did not pour from the thermos for a while. I sat with my hands on my legs and I looked at the hemlock bow lying across the bench, and I breathed. When I finally poured, I poured into the thermos cup, and I held it in both hands the way Ruthen always held hers, and I looked at the gap in the ridge where the sun had been an hour before, and the decision I had been carrying for 7 months settled without argument. I was not going to sell the property. I did not arrive at this through any process I can lay out in steps. I simply knew it the way you know certain things when you have been sitting still long enough in a place that has your full attention. The cabin was where Ruthen had lived her last 18 months of good days, and it was where her kitchen still had the faint smell of the coffee she made, and it was 6 acres of ground she had walked every season we owned it. And the idea of putting it in the hands of Garrett Pulliam so I could go somewhere she was not felt suddenly like the wrong reading of what I was supposed to do next. What I was supposed to do next, I did not know entirely. That was all right. Knowing what I was not going to do was enough for the evening. I drove down the mountain in the dark with Dell asleep against me and the thermos empty on the floor and the heater running, and all of it felt different from the drive up, the way the same road can feel entirely different in each direction. I did not have a word for what had happened on that pullout, and I was not going to manufacture one. I had been a fire lookout for 31 years, and I had a high standard for the accuracy of my reports. What I would have reported was this: I went to the mountain to make a decision I could not make at lower elevation. Something was already there. Whatever it was, it rearranged a bench to face the view my wife preferred, and it set a hemlock bow on it the way my wife set things on benches before she sat, and it stood in the hemlock stand and watched me sit there in the dark until I poured from her thermos and decided to stay. That is the report. I have no category for the author of it. I do not need one. The weeks after were ordinary in most respects. I called Garrett Pulliam and told him I would not be moving forward, and he said he understood and that the offer would stand for another season if I changed my mind. I thanked him and said I would not. The cabin felt slightly larger after that, in the rooms rather than in the square footage, if that makes any sense. I had been moving through it sideways since the funeral, staying near the walls, and gradually I found myself using the middle of the rooms again. Dell stayed close, but in the easier way of an old dog whose person has stopped being a problem he was trying to solve. 3 weeks after the mountain, on a Thursday evening in late October, I stood in the kitchen for about 10 minutes with the phone in my hand before I dialed Warren's number. I had rehearsed the conversation so many times that when he picked up on the 3rd ring, every version of it went out of my head, and I said his name. Warren. He said, "Dad." Neither of us said anything for a moment after that. I could hear him breathing and some sound behind him that was probably a television, and I thought about how far East Ohio was and how long it had been, and none of what I had prepared seemed to fit through the opening. I said, "I'm sorry about the way things ended at the funeral." He said, "Me too." His voice had the specific texture of a man who has been ready to say a thing for longer than he wants to admit. There was another silence, and then he said, "Are you keeping the place?" I said I was. He said, "Good." And then he said, "I'd like to come out sometime, if that's all right." I told him it was more than all right, and I meant it, and we talked for a little under an hour after that, which was longer than we had talked on the phone in years. We did not resolve everything. There were things on both sides that would need more than one conversation. That did not feel like a problem. It felt like something to do. Winter came down off the ridge, and I put the property to bed the way you do. Drained the outdoor lines, banked the wood stove, brought Dell's water bowl inside for the cold months. I thought about the pull-out most mornings in a quiet way. Not with the weight I had been carrying, but the way you think about a place you know you will return to. I thought about those impressions in the hemlock duff. I thought about the bench angle, and the care in the placement of the bow, and the 12 minutes of stillness in the tree line, and the way Dell had rested his chin on my boot, as if to say that everything was accounted for, and I could put my attention somewhere useful. I have no explanation for what was in that hemlock stand. I spent 31 years in the Cascade Wilderness, and I did not see anything like it in those years, which does not mean it was not there. It means I was not alone in a particular place at a particular moment, with a particular weight on me, and it was. I have thought about whether the weight was the condition. I do not know. What I know is that the bench was moved and the boaf was laid, and the silence was deliberate, and whatever intelligence arranged those things had been paying attention in a way that I had not been paid attention to in 18 months. That is not nothing. I am a man who has spent his life measuring what is not nothing. Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes does in the Cascades, with false starts in March and then a proper cold snap in the first week of April before the thaw took hold. The fire road opened on the 14th of April, and I drove it the following Saturday with Dell in the cab and the thermos packed the way I had packed it in October. The pull-out was empty. It was a Saturday, but early, before 8, and the light was still low and cold through the hemlock canopy on the east side. Dell got out and did his perimeter the same as always, a little slower than October because his hips had stiffened over the winter, but thorough, nose to the gravel and the duff, back and forth along the margin. I went straight to the bench. The boff was still there. 7 months, through the full wet weight of a Cascade winter, and it was still lying where it had been placed in October. The needles had dried to a grey silver. The colour old wood goes when it has given up everything but its structure. The boff had not blown off in the winter storms, had not been disturbed by whatever moved through the pull-out in the months since. It lay exactly as it had been set. I stood over it for a while. Then I sat beside it, on the right side of the bench, and I poured from the thermos, and I looked at the gap in the western ridge through the hemlock canopy, and the light did what light does in the Cascades in April, coming in low and pale and slowly warming, and the birds had come back to the slope below the pull-out. Thrush and junco and somewhere a pileated working a dead fir snag. The specific 3 beatnock that carries a long distance in still morning air. Dell came and lay down at my left foot. I looked at the hemlock stand at the north edge of the pull-out for a long time. Nothing moved in it. The light moved through it the way light moves through old growth, in slow columns that shift as the sun climbs, and the interior stayed dark and dense and quiet. I did not expect to see anything. I had come back to sit on the bench that had been prepared for me, and to pour from the thermos that Ruthen had always packed, and to look at the view she had always preferred, and that was enough. I have not told this story to many people. I have told the broad shape of it to one, and I have told the whole thing here, and I do not expect anyone to place it in a category they find comfortable. I do not have a comfortable category for it myself, and I have made my peace with that. I spent my life in wilderness that most people see from a highway, and I know how little of it we have accounted for, and I know how much of it was watching us long before we thought to look back. What I carry from that October evening is not the image of something large in the hemlock dark, though that image is clear, and I will not be rid of it. What I carry is the bench in its new position, and the boaf on its surface, and the particular quality of the decision that settled in me while I sat there. A decision that had been impossible for 7 months, and became possible in 20 minutes of a creature's patient attention. Patience is its own kind of care. I think I knew that once, and had forgotten it, and something up in that hemlock stand reminded me without using a single word. Dell shifted at my foot, settling deeper into the morning, and the pileated went on knocking at the dead fir, and the light kept coming. If something like this has ever come to you in a quiet place, when you were carrying more than you could set down, I think you know what I mean when I say it does not require a name. Whatever it was paying attention. That has not stopped being enough.